The merciless August heat of 1879 descended upon Willow Springs like a blacksmith's forge, turning the wooden sidewalks into an oven that cracked and groaned with each footfall. Mary Whitlock sought refuge beneath an ancient cottonwood at the town's edge, her weathered hands folded tightly in her lap, as she tried to escape the brutal sun. At 38, she bore the accumulated scars of 15 harsh frontier years, deep lines carved around her green eyes, from squinting against endless prairie storms, silver threading through auburn hair. She kept pinned with ruthless practicality and shoulders that remained unbowed, despite carrying burdens that would have crushed weaker souls. A shadow fell across her path, though no footsteps had announced its arrival. The man who knelt before her moved with the silent precision of morning mist drifting across still water, each gesture controlled and purposeful. Nahayosi had been transformed utterly from the skeletal 16-year-old boy she'd pulled bleeding from her doorway during that killing winter of 1864. Now 31, he possessed the coiled strength of a mountain cat, his broad shoulders filling buckskin decorated with intricate quillwork that told stories of battles survived and honors earned. A single hawk feather hung from a thin braid behind his left ear, and his dark eyes held depths that spoke of promises kept sacred across impossible distances. Mary Whitlock. Her name rolled from his tongue with the careful precision of someone who'd mastered English through grim necessity rather than classroom comfort. The sound transported her backward 15 years to firelit nights spent teaching him words while his bullet wound festered and slowly healed. "I swore a blood oath to you once," she remembered. A fever-broken boy's whispered words as delirium finally released its strangling grip. "I will carry this debt in my bones until the day I can repay it with my life." "I found her," he said with devastating simplicity, and Mary's carefully constructed world shattered like ice struck by lightning. Julia, her daughter, the 8-year-old girl who'd vanished into the spring deluge at Dusty Fork Crossing, leaving behind only a child's torn yellow ribbon and one small muddy shoe tangled in the flood debris. 15 endless years of sleepless nights, of scanning every child's face in every settlement they encountered, of finally accepting what everyone insisted was immutable truth, that her baby was dead, claimed by waters that had taken 3 other precious lives that terrible day. From Willow Springs came the familiar symphony of frontier existence, hammer-striking anvil in rhythmic percussion, a mule's indignant protest against its burden wagon wheels grinding through dust thick as flour. But here, in the cottonwood's blessed shade, with this man kneeling like a penitent, bearing impossible news reality, had collapsed to the space between one heartbeat and the next. A gunshot cracked from the main street sharp as breaking bone in the stillness. Nahiyosi's head snapped toward the sound, with predatory alertness, his body shifting with instinctive precision to place himself between Mary and potential danger. The movement was unconscious protective, born from years of survival in contested territory, where trust was the thin line separating life from unmarked graves. "Sheriff Pike knows I'm here," he said quietly, attention returning to her face with flint-hard intensity. "Knows what I've discovered about his operation. His men are already hunting us both with orders to kill on sight." Mary met his steady gaze, seeing in those midnight depths the same quiet fire she remembered from that desperate winter. But now, something more burned there, a debt carried across 15 years of separation and violence, a promise kept despite the mortal dangers it would unleash upon them all. Her pulse began hammering as the full implication struck her like physical blows. "Tell me everything," she said, her voice steadier than her racing heart had any right to expect. Thunder rumbled ominously in the distance, promising one of the violent storms that could transform peaceful creeks into raging torrents overnight. But Mary Whitlock had survived far worse than storms. Now she faced the fight of her life to reclaim the daughter she'd never stopped loving, and expose the men who'd built their corrupt empire on stolen children's suffering. The boy she'd saved had returned as a man of unbreakable word. The time for hiding in shadows was over forever. Winter had descended upon Prairie Rose Settlement like a curse from God in 1864, burying the Nebraska Territory under 3 feet of snow that wouldn't surrender to spring until April's grudging arrival. Mary Whitlock had been widowed exactly 2 months when she discovered the wounded boy collapsed against her door, bright blood seeping through crude bandages wrapped around his left calf. Thomas had succumbed to fever in September, leaving her alone with 8-year-old Julia in their sod house perched on civilization's razor edge. The boy couldn't have been more than 16, all jutting bones and hollow cheeks beneath copper skin stretched drum-tight over his skull. He wore buckskin leggings and a thin cotton shirt that offered pathetic protection against the killing cold. A settler's rifle bullet had torn through his leg while he hunted rabbits near Willow Creek, too close to claimed land for the vigilante's twisted sense of justice. Any sensible woman would have turned him away without hesitation. Charles Hargreaves, who'd taken the name Red Oak after some long-forgotten grievance, had made the local position brutally clear through his band of self-appointed guardians. Any Indian found on settler land would be shot on sight. No questions asked, no mercy extended. Red Oak claimed to protect the community's interests, but Mary had witnessed the sadistic cruelty burning in his pale eyes, the way he savored the paralyzing fear his reputation spread like plague through the settlement. But the boy was dying by painful inches, and Mary Whitlock had never been accused of possessing good sense. She dragged him inside with Julia's help, both of them struggling under his unconscious dead weight. For 3 agonizing days, she battled infection with willow bark tea and honey poultices, while Julia stood vigilant watch for approaching riders. When fever finally released its strangling grip, the boy opened dark eyes and whispered a single word, "Nahiosi." "That your name?" Mary asked gently, spooning warm broth between his cracked, bloodless lips. He nodded weakly. "Means kicks the enemy." But I could not kick fast enough this time. Despite everything, the danger, the uncertainty, the bone-deep exhaustion, Mary found herself smiling. "Well, Nahiosi, you're still breathing. That counts for something in this harsh world." For 3 perilous weeks, he hid in their root cellar whenever hoofbeats thundered past their door. Red Oak himself searched the house twice, his cold gaze lingering on Mary with interest that made her skin crawl like insects. "Helping savages is dangerous work, Widow Whitlock," he'd said, running thick fingers along her kitchen table with casual menace. "Terrible accidents happen to women who forget their proper place in the natural order." But they found nothing incriminating. Julia had possessed the quick thinking to hide Nahiosi's bow and a small beaded charm he'd been crafting in the smokehouse, concealed behind strips of hanging venison. The charm was a fox wrought from blue glass beads, intricate beyond belief, despite being fashioned by hands that shook with hunger and constant pain. As winter gradually loosened its death grip and the worst cold finally passed, Nahiosi grew stronger by painful degrees. Mary taught him English words by flickering lamplight, and he showed Julia how to read animal tracks in the snow surrounding their isolated cabin. They became, for those brief, precious weeks, something resembling a family bound together by necessity and mutual protection against the hostile world outside. One March morning, Mary woke to find him gone without trace. Only the beaded charm remained left on her kitchen table beside a piece of soft doeskin, his way of expressing both gratitude and farewell in the wordless language of survival. 6 weeks later, spring floods came early and vicious as rattlesnakes. The dusty Fork crossing, normally a gentle wade suitable for children, became a torrential nightmare that swept away 2 wagons and claimed 3 precious lives. Julia had been riding with the Brennan family to a church social when the wall of water struck with biblical fury. In the ensuing chaos, she simply vanished like smoke on the wind. They found her small shoe downstream, along with that beloved yellow ribbon from her hair. Sheriff Walter Pike organized a 3-day search that yielded nothing but debris and shattered hopes. "River don't always give 'em back, ma'am," he'd said with what passed for frontier sympathy. "Best to accept the Lord's will and move forward with your life." But Mary couldn't accept that convenient lie. Something about Pike's manner, the way his eyes refused to meet hers directly, the nervous fidgeting with his hat brim, and the almost eager way he dismissed her questions, told her he wasn't being entirely truthful. Her persistent inquiries were dismissed with increasing irritation, her growing suspicions ignored with bureaucratic disdain. She was just one grieving widow, with no money and no political influence, in a territory where might made the only law that mattered. Years crawled past like wounded animals seeking shelter. Mary survived by taking in sewing, cooking for cattle drives, and tending her small garden with religious devotion. She made friends slowly and carefully, Dr. Frederick Owen, who treated her winter ailments with gentle hands and never asked for payment. Grace Miller, the stern schoolteacher who'd arrived 3 years back, carrying strong opinions about justice and children's rights. Joseph Keating, a struggling farmer who traded vegetables for mending work, and seemed to understand her grief without requiring explanations. It was Joseph who'd been most persistent in his kindness, she reflected now. Always appearing when she needed help most, always asking careful questions about her plans, her hopes, her slowly healing heart. Just last month he'd lingered after delivering a basket of turnips, his weathered face unusually serious, as he'd asked about her memories of Julia. "Must be hard carrying all that uncertainty," he'd said, settling uninvited at her kitchen table. "Never knowing for sure what happened. Makes a person wonder if there might be clues out there. Things that could still be found if someone knew where to look." She'd thought it odd at the time, the way his questions seemed to probe at the edges of old wounds. But grief had made her grateful for any genuine interest in her loss. And she'd answered freely, telling him about the nightmares that still woke her, the way she sometimes caught herself setting 2 places at the table before remembering Julia was gone. Through it all, she kept Julia's room exactly as it had been on that last morning, down to the rag doll constructed from Thomas's old work shirts and half of a tin locket she'd given the girl for her 7th birthday. The other half had been lost in the flood, another small treasure claimed by those hungry, merciless waters. She never forgot Nahiosi either. Sometimes on crystal-clear winter nights, when the stars seemed close enough to pluck from the sky, she'd wonder what had become of the wounded boy who'd learned to laugh at Julia's silly games despite the mortal danger surrounding them all. The territorial conflicts had grown progressively worse after '64, with atrocities committed on both sides, and precious little mercy wasted on anyone caught between the grinding millstones of racial hatred. Now, 15 years later, she finally understood why Sheriff Pike had lied about the search with such casual conviction. Red Oak's operation hadn't been limited to terrorizing Indians and troublesome settlers who challenged his authority. He'd been running a far more profitable scheme, systematically taking children from disasters and selling them into indentured servitude, a practice that walked the thin legal edge in the chaotic territories where documentation was sparse and questions rarely asked by those in power. She's working at Henderson's boarding house in Sable Junction. Nahiosi continued his English, now fluent, despite the occasional careful pause for emphasis. Goes by the name Lottie now. But Klaus Dietrich keeps meticulous records, and I've seen them with my own eyes. A girl with a crescent scar on her left ankle and half a tin locket bearing the initials JW. Mary's hand moved instinctively toward the trunk, where she kept Julia's precious belongings, including the matching half of that long-lost locket. Her stomach clenched into tight knots as hope and terror warred in her chest, like battling armies. "You're absolutely certain?" certain enough to risk everything coming back here to find you. His eyes held hers with unwavering intensity that seemed to pierce straight through to her soul. She's scheduled to leave tomorrow on the afternoon train, bound for the Black Mesa mines deep in the mountains. Once she disappears into that country, we'll never find another trace of her. The accumulated weight of 15 years pressed down on Mary's shoulders like a physical burden she could barely support. All those endless nights lying awake, wondering if Julia was cold, hungry, afraid, or even still breathing. All those mornings waking with fragile hope that would die by noon when no news came from the outside world. And through it all, her daughter had been alive, but trapped in a legal system that treated children like livestock to be bought, sold, and worked until they broke completely. "Then we take her tonight," Mary said with quiet finality that surprised them both with its steel-hard resolve. A second gunshot echoed from the town's direction, noticeably closer this time, and carrying the sharp crack of purpose rather than accident. Nahiosi rose to his feet with smooth efficiency, offering Mary his calloused hand. When she took it, she felt the accumulated scars of years spent making hard choices and harder compromises. His grip was warm, steady, completely certain of purpose, and unwavering in its strength. "There will be considerable dangers ahead," he warned with characteristic honesty that had always marked their dealings. Mary thought of Julia at 8 years old, brave enough to help hide a wounded enemy from men who would have tortured him to death without hesitation or remorse. That courageous child was now a woman of 23, and she deserved to know her mother had never stopped fighting for her freedom with every breath in her body. "I've lived with danger as my constant companion for 15 years. She replied, rising to stand beside him with newfound determination. "Time to stop running from it and face these devils head on." As they prepared to leave the Cottonwoods' protective shelter, Mary felt something fundamental shift in the space between them. Nahiosi had returned as a man keeping sacred faith with a promise made by a desperate boy facing death. But the protective way he positioned his body, the careful attention he paid to her comfort and safety, these spoke of something deeper and more complex than mere obligation or even profound gratitude. The sun was sliding toward the western horizon, painting the endless grassland in shades of gold and burnished copper that spoke of days ending and nights approaching dangers. Darkness would bring fresh perils, but also new possibilities for those brave enough to seize them with both hands. In Shadow's embrace, a determined woman and a skilled warrior might accomplish what daylight would render impossible through exposure. Mary Whitlock had spent 15 years learning to live with crushing loss and unanswered questions. Now it was time to discover what she could win back through courage, determination, and bonds forged in the flames of shared suffering. Sable Junction squatted in a narrow valley 20 miles east of Willow Springs, a collection of weathered frame buildings that had sprouted around the railroad depot like weeds after a spring rain. It served the surrounding mining camps and lumber operations, exactly the sort of place where people minded their own business religiously. And strangers were common enough to pass unnoticed, provided they exercised proper caution and didn't ask uncomfortable questions. Mary and Nahiosi reached the town's outskirts just as the sun touched the western mountains, having traveled exclusively by game trails and dry creek beds that kept them well away from main roads where Pike's men might be watching. Nahiosi had learned these hidden paths during the worst years of territorial conflicts, when moving unseen through disputed country literally meant the difference between life and an unmarked grave in some forgotten canyon. Henderson's boarding house squatted on a side street, a sagging 2-story structure with peeling paint and windows that hadn't seen soap or honest scrubbing in months. They positioned themselves in the narrow alley directly across the way, concealed behind mining equipment that offered both excellent cover and clear sight lines to the building's front entrance and the comings and goings of its residents. "There," Nahiosi murmured, pointing toward a second-floor window, with barely controlled excitement threading through his carefully modulated voice. Mary's breath caught in her throat, like sand blown by desert wind. A young woman stood framed in the lamplight, methodically cleaning glass from inside, with the mechanical motions of someone performing endless soul-crushing, repetitive labor. Even at this distance, even after 15 years of separation and change, Mary recognized those shoulders, the distinctive way her daughter tucked a wayward strand of brown hair behind her ear with unconscious grace. Julia had grown thin and worn down by years of hard labor, her once bright eyes now holding the wary watchfulness of someone who'd learned that survival meant constant vigilance. But there was something in her posture, a straightness to her spine, an alertness in the way she moved that spoke of an unbroken spirit, despite everything she'd endured. The child who'd helped hide a wounded stranger had grown into a woman who'd learned to protect herself through careful observation and quiet strength. She favors her left leg, Nahiosi observed with a tracker's trained eye as they watched Julia move away from the window. The old ankle injury still troubles her after all these years. Physical proof to match the locket if they could somehow get close enough to verify the scar's presence. But approaching meant dealing with Snakebite Sue, the notoriously hard-faced woman who ran the boarding house for Red Oak's operation with an iron fist and a shotgun always within easy reach. Sue prowled the front porch constantly with that weapon cradled in her arms, like a beloved infant, her flint-colored eyes missing absolutely nothing that transpired on her designated stretch of street. They maintained their vigil for over an hour, carefully noting movement patterns, the comings and goings of miners heading to night shifts, the subtle routines that governed this small piece of Red Oak's empire. Mary's pulse raced each time Julia appeared at that window, so tantalizingly close, yet impossibly far away, separated by more than mere distance. Her daughter had been reduced to nothing more than a line item in someone else's ledger, scheduled for transport like cattle or mining equipment. We need legal proof of identity, Mary realized with growing urgency as the full scope of their challenge became clear. Birth records, family documentation, something official that proves she belongs to me. County records are locked away in Pike's office. Nahiosi agreed grimly, his expression darkening with the knowledge of what such a mission would entail. But he'll be expecting exactly that move from us. Mary thought of Grace Miller, who'd been pushing relentlessly for better record-keeping since her arrival in Willow Springs 3 years back. The school teacher had complained loudly and frequently about missing documentation that affected her ability to properly enroll students. Grace has been copying documents for the school district. Pike gave her access to the files when she complained about missing birth certificates affecting her work. They made their careful way through Sable Junction's back streets as full darkness settled over the valley like a suffocating blanket. Grace's small house sat directly behind the schoolhouse, warm lamplight, glowing invitingly in her windows like a beacon of civilization in the wilderness. But even here, in this haven of learning and order, danger lurked in every shadow. She answered their quiet knock with her rifle already in hand, relaxing only when she recognized Mary's familiar voice through the wooden door. "Get inside immediately," Grace said tersely, ushering them into her neat parlor with obvious urgency. "Half the territory's hunting you two by now. Pike's put out word that you're dangerous fugitives who killed a deputy." Her sitting room was lined floor to ceiling with books and papers, the organized workspace of someone who truly believed knowledge was the most powerful weapon against injustice and tyranny. Grace poured coffee that had been keeping warm on the wood stove and listened with growing anger as Nahiosi explained their discoveries in careful detail, his voice never rising above a conversational tone despite the explosive nature of his revelations. "I knew something was fundamentally wrong with that flood," Grace said when he finished his account, her hands trembling slightly with suppressed rage. "Far too many children supposedly drowned without a single body ever being recovered for proper burial. But Pike wouldn't tolerate questions about his investigation, and I was just a schoolteacher with no authority to challenge him. Mary leaned forward in her chair, hands clasped tightly in her lap to keep them from shaking. "Can you get us access to the county records tonight?" Grace nodded slowly, her expression hardening with resolve that transformed her plain features into something fierce and determined. "Pike gave me the master key last month when I complained about missing birth certificates affecting school enrollment. He probably forgot he did it in his usual careless fashion." She paused, studying Mary's face in the lamplight with obvious concern. "But this is extraordinarily dangerous work, Mary. If we're caught in there, then we're caught fighting for something that truly matters," Mary replied with simple conviction that brooked no argument. At the stroke of midnight, Grace led them through twisting back streets to the sheriff's office, moving with the careful precision of someone who'd scouted this route beforehand. The building sat on Main Street, like a monument to frontier justice, its windows black and unwelcoming as grave markers. But Grace's key turned easily in the rear door's lock, and they slipped inside with only a single, flickering candle to guide their way through the darkness. The county records were kept in a massive wooden filing cabinet that spoke eloquently of Pike's casual approach to law enforcement documents, stuffed haphazardly into folders without regard for organization or proper preservation, some dating back to the territory's original incorporation. They found Julia's birth certificate in a section marked 1856-1860, Julia Whitlock, born March 15, 1856. To Thomas and Mary Whitlock of Prairie Rose Settlement, father's occupation. Listed as farmer mothers, as seamstress and midwife. Grace was carefully copying the document's essential information when heavy boots began echoing on the wooden sidewalk outside, approaching with unmistakable, hostile purpose. Nahiyasi immediately blew out their candle and moved to the window, peering cautiously through a gap in the faded curtains while motioning for absolute silence. "5 men armed with rifles," he whispered urgently. "Pike's leading them personally, and they're moving with military precision." They were trapped like animals in a cage with no viable escape route except up. The front door was locked from inside, and the back exit opened directly onto an alley where the approaching men would spot them immediately. But Pike had made one crucial tactical error. He'd built his office directly beneath the town's only 2-story commercial building, and the ceiling above them was nothing more than pine planks and prayer. "Upstairs," Grace whispered, tucking the precious copied certificate securely into her dress. "There's a storage room with a window that opens onto Peterson's general store roof." They climbed the narrow stairs in absolute darkness, feeling their way along walls rough with splinters and age, while listening to the sound of Pike's men positioning themselves around the building below. Behind them, someone began hammering the front door with rifle butts, the sound echoing through the building like cannon fire. The upstairs window was small and warped with age, its frame swollen tight from years of prairie weather. Nahiyasi managed to force it open after several tense moments of struggle, the wood groaning in protest, loud enough to wake the dead. The gap between buildings was perhaps 4 feet across, with a potentially fatal 15-foot drop to the alley below if anyone missed their landing. Not impossible for experienced frontier survivors, but utterly unforgiving of mistakes or hesitation. "Ladies first," he said quietly, his voice steady despite the approaching danger and the sound of splintering wood from below. Grace went across without hesitation, her schoolteacher's practical nature serving her well as she landed silently on the wooden shingles like a cat. Mary followed, feeling Nahiyosi's steady hand on her back as she balanced precariously on the narrow windowsill. The jump was absolutely terrifying, but she made it safely, rolling to absorb the impact, exactly as he'd quietly instructed during their approach to the building. Nahiyosi came last, just as they heard the sheriff's office door splinter inward under repeated blows from rifle butts and boot heels. He cleared the gap easily with practiced ease, but as he landed, a loose shingle cracked loudly in the still night air, the sound echoing off surrounding buildings like a gunshot, announcing their position to anyone listening. Below them in the alley, Pike's voice called out with venomous authority that carried clearly in the thin mountain air. "Up on the roof, I heard something moving up there. Surround the building and don't let them escape." A rifle shot shattered the peaceful night, the bullet splintering wood dangerously close to Mary's head and sending splinters flying like shrapnel. She felt Nahiyosi's powerful hand close around her wrist, pulling her urgently toward the building's far edge as boots thundered on the roof behind them like approaching doom incarnate. The next building was too far away to jump safely, but a rope hung from a pulley system used to haul supplies to the store's second-floor storage area. Grace was already sliding down the line when Nahiyosi pushed Mary toward their only escape route with desperate urgency. "Go now," he urged with quiet intensity that somehow carried more authority than shouting. "I'm right behind you." Mary grabbed the rope and let gravity take her friction, burning her palms as she tried desperately to control her descent through sheer will and determination. She hit the ground harder than expected, pain shooting through her left ankle like liquid fire, but managed to stay upright through necessity rather than grace. Grace steadied her as they both looked back anxiously at the roof where their fate hung in the balance. Nahiyosi stood silhouetted against the star-filled sky, Pike's rifle trained on him across the narrow gap with deadly precision, born of years of practice. For a moment that stretched like eternity, the two men faced each other across the space between buildings, hunter and hunted, in a game that could only end in death or escape. "Should have minded your own business, half-blood." Pike called out, his voice thick with whiskey and 15 years of accumulated malice that had festered like an infected wound. "Should have stayed with your own kind where you belong." Nahiyosi smiled, white teeth flashing in the darkness like a wolf's bared fangs ready for battle. "Should have been an honest lawman, Pike." "Too late for both of us to change our natures now." He grabbed the rope and swung wide, using momentum to carry him away from Pike's line of fire with athletic grace that spoke of countless similar escapes. The sheriff's shot went wild, and by the time he could work his rifle's lever action for another round, Nahiyosi was safely on the ground beside them, already moving toward their horses. They ran then through back alleys and side streets until they reached the town's edge where they'd concealed their horses in a grove of cottonwoods that offered perfect concealment from casual observation. Behind them, Sable Junction was coming alive with shouting voices and swinging lantern light. But they'd accomplished their mission successfully despite the close call. Julia's birth certificate was safe in Grace's dress, legal proof of identity that no court could dispute or dismiss. Now, they just had to survive long enough to use it effectively in the coming confrontation with Red Oak's operation. As they mounted their horses and prepared to ride toward the relative safety of Willow Springs, Mary became acutely aware that her ankle was swelling badly from the landing, each step sending fresh waves of pain up her leg. She tried to conceal the injury, but Nahiyosi's trained eyes noticed immediately, with the same alertness that had kept him alive through countless battles. "How bad is it?" he asked, his voice carrying concern that went far beyond tactical necessity or simple courtesy. "I'll manage somehow," Mary replied through gritted teeth, not wanting to slow their escape or become a burden when speed was essential for survival. Without a word, he dismounted and knelt beside her horse, his hands gentle as warm sunlight as he examined the injury through her boot leather with careful precision. His touch was professional but intimate, and Mary found herself acutely aware of his fingers' warmth, of the protective way he positioned himself to support her weight if needed. When he looked up at her, their faces were close enough that she could see starlight reflected in his dark eyes like distant campfires. "Sprained, not broken," he diagnosed with obvious relief flooding his voice. "But you'll need to stay off it for several days to heal properly." "We don't have the luxury of several days for recovery," Mary pointed out with practical honesty that couldn't be argued. Nahiosi continued looking up at her, and in the moonlight, she could see something in his expression that had nothing to do with their desperate mission and everything to do with the woman he was touching so carefully. "Then we'll make the time we have count for something meaningful." There was a promise embedded in those quietly spoken words, a commitment that extended far beyond helping her rescue Julia from her captors. Mary felt something shift deep in her chest, not the fluttering of girlish attraction, but the profound recognition of true partnership that transcended mere physical or emotional connection and reached something deeper. "We should leave immediately," Grace said quietly, but there was understanding in her voice rather than impatience. She'd witnessed the way Nahiosi watched Mary protective instincts that reached far beyond duty or simple gratitude and touched something more fundamental. As they rode through the night toward Willow Springs, Mary found herself thinking about the wounded boy who'd learned English by her fireside, and the deadly man who just risked his life to help her find legal proof of Julia's identity. Somewhere in the years between that desperate winter and this moment of reckoning, simple gratitude had grown into something deeper and infinitely more complex than either had expected. But their journey home would prove far more dangerous than any of them anticipated. They had ridden perhaps 10 miles when Nahiosi suddenly raised his hand, bringing their small party to an immediate halt. His head was tilted slightly, listening to sounds that Mary's untrained ears couldn't detect. In the distance, carried on the night wind, came the faint but unmistakable sound of multiple horses moving at speed. "How many?" Grace whispered, her rifle already in her hands. 6, maybe 8, moving fast and coming this way." Nahiosi's expression was grim as he studied the terrain around them. They were in open country with little cover, except for a narrow creek lined with willow trees about a quarter mile to their south. "They're tracking us." Pike's men had picked up their trail somehow, despite their careful precautions. Perhaps someone in Sable Junction had seen them leaving, or maybe Pike himself was a better tracker than they'd given him credit for. Either way, they were being hunted through the darkness by men who knew this country and had no intention of taking prisoners. "The creek," Mary said, pointing toward the line of trees barely visible in the starlight. "We can lose them in the water." Nahiosi nodded, but his expression remained troubled. "It's our best chance, but we'll have to abandon the horses. Can't risk them giving away our position." They rode hard for the creek, their mounts' hooves thundering against the hard-packed earth. Behind them, the sounds of pursuit were growing closer, and Mary could see dust clouds rising in the starlight. Pike's men were pushing their horses to the limit, determined to catch their quarry before dawn. They reached the creek just as the first rifle shots cracked through the night, air bullets whining overhead like angry hornets. Nahiosi was off his horse before it had fully stopped helping Mary down, while Grace gathered their essential supplies. They drove the horses upstream, hoping to confuse the trail, then slipped into the cold water and began working their way downstream through the willows. The creek was deeper than it looked, reaching nearly to Mary's waist in places. The current was strong enough to make walking treacherous, and her injured ankle sent jolts of pain through her leg with each step. But the sound of the water would mask their movements, and the thick growth of willows provided excellent concealment from searching eyes. They had been in the water for perhaps 20 minutes when they heard voices approaching their original position. Pike's men had reached the creek and were spreading out, some following the horse tracks upstream, while others searched the banks for signs of their quarry. "Lost them in the water?" One voice called out, frustration clear in his tone. "Could have gone either direction." "Split up," came Pike's voice, harsh and commanding. 3 men upstream, 3 downstream. They can't have gone far with that injured woman slowing them down. Mary felt Nahiosi's hand on her arm, steadying her as they crouched in the shadows beneath an overhanging willow. His touch was warm and reassuring, a silent promise that he wouldn't let anything happen to her. In that moment, surrounded by cold water and mortal danger, she realized that somewhere during their desperate flight, her feelings for this man had grown beyond simple gratitude into something deeper and more complex. They waited in the water for what felt like hours, listening to Pike's men search the creek banks with increasing frustration. Mary's ankle throbbed constantly, and the cold water had numbed her legs until she could barely feel them. But Nahiosi's presence beside her gave her strength, his calm confidence infectious, even in their desperate circumstances. Finally, as dawn began to lighten the eastern sky, the sounds of pursuit faded into the distance. Pike's men had given up the search, at least for now. They would be back with more men and better tracking skills, but for the moment, Mary and her companions were safe. They emerged from the creek like bedraggled refugees, their clothes sodden and their supplies waterlogged. But they were alive, and they still had Julia's birth certificate safely tucked away in Grace's dress. More importantly, they had learned something valuable about their enemy. Pike was desperate enough to risk men and resources on a nighttime pursuit, which meant their mission was having an effect. "We need shelter," Nahiosi said, studying the surrounding countryside with a tactical eye. "Somewhere to rest and dry out before we continue." He led them to a small cave, hidden in the rocks about a mile from the creek, a place he'd obviously used before during his years of moving unseen through hostile territory. The cave was dry and well concealed with a narrow entrance that could be easily defended if necessary. Inside, Mary finally allowed herself to examine her injured ankle properly. The cold water had reduced some of the swelling, but the joint was still tender and discolored. Nahiosi knelt beside her, his hands gentle as he helped remove her wet boot and stocking. "I should have been more careful on that roof," she said, wincing as he probed the injury with careful fingers. "You did fine," he replied, his voice soft in the confines of the cave. "Better than fine. You kept up with us through everything, never complained, never held us back. Julia's going to be proud of her mother when she learns what you've done to find her." There was something in his tone that made Mary look at him more closely. In the dim light filtering through the cave entrance, she could see exhaustion etched in the lines around his dark eyes, but also something else, a tenderness that had nothing to do with doctoring her injury. "Nahiosi," she began, not sure what she wanted to say. "I know," he said quietly. "This isn't the time or place for such thoughts. But I need you to know these past few days, riding with you, fighting beside you, it's reminded me what it means to have something worth protecting. Someone worth protecting." Mary felt her breath catch in her throat. "The promise you made was about debt and honor, yes. But this—" He gestured between them, his expression serious. "This is about choice. My choice. And when this is over, when Julia's safe, I hope you'll consider making a choice too." Before Mary could respond, Grace's voice called softly from the cave entrance. "Riders approaching. Looks like they're heading back toward town." The moment was broken, but not forgotten. As they gathered their few belongings and prepared to continue their journey, Mary found herself stealing glances at Nahiosi, seeing him with new eyes. The wounded boy she'd saved had grown into a man capable of great loyalty and deeper feelings than she'd imagined. And somewhere in the space between that desperate winter night and this cave where they sheltered from their enemies, her own heart had opened to possibilities she'd thought were lost forever. They reached the outskirts of Willow Springs as the sun climbed toward its brutal peak, bone-tired and still damp from their ordeal in the creek. But their trials were far from over. In fact, they were about to face their greatest test yet. Dawn brought no relief from the oppressive heat that had been building for days, and as they approached Dr. Owen's office, Mary felt a growing unease that had nothing to do with their perilous flight through the night. Something in the air felt wrong, charged with tension, like the moments before a lightning strike. Dr. Owen met them at his door, his usually calm demeanor replaced by obvious agitation. "Thank God you're safe," he said, ushering them inside quickly. "Joseph's been here since before dawn waiting for you." Mary felt her stomach drop. Joseph Keating sat at Owen's kitchen table, but everything about his posture and expression had changed. Gone was the struggling farmer who traded vegetables for mending work. In his place sat a stranger with calculating eyes and a stillness that spoke of hidden violence. "You," Mary whispered, understanding dawning like a cold sunrise over her consciousness. "You've been working for them all along." Joseph nodded slowly, his hand moving to rest on the pistol at his hip with casual familiarity. 15 years I've been watching you, reporting back to Red Oak about your activities, your state of mind, whether you were getting too close to the truth about your daughter's disappearance. The betrayal hit her like a physical blow, but it was the transformation in Joseph's manner that truly frightened her. All those conversations, all those moments of shared grief and understanding, and they had been nothing but performance-gathering intelligence for her enemies. "Why?" Mary asked, her voice barely above a whisper, as 15 years of perceived friendship crumbled into dust and betrayal. "Money mainly," Joseph replied with brutal honesty that was somehow worse than any elaborate justification would have been. "Red Oak pays well for information, and farming's a hard way to make a living out here. But also," his gaze flicked toward Nahiosi with undisguised hatred, "because you never looked at me the way you look at him. 15 years I've been right here available, interested. But you save your smiles for a savage who spent 3 weeks in your house." The jealousy in his voice was toxic, poisonous, speaking of obsession that had festered for years beneath a mask of friendship. Mary felt physically sick as she realized how thoroughly she'd been deceived, how completely she'd trusted someone who'd been reporting her every move to her enemies. "I remember now," Mary said suddenly, pieces falling into place. "Last month when you asked about Julia, you weren't being sympathetic, you were checking to see if I'd given up hope, if I was still a threat to their operation." Joseph's smile was cold as winter wind. "Very good. Yes, that conversation was quite illuminating. Red Oak was pleased to learn that you still kept her room like a shrine, still believed in fairy tales about lost children finding their way home." Nahiosi had been silent through this exchange, but Mary could feel the coiled tension in him like a predator preparing to strike. His dark eyes never left Joseph's face, calculating distances and angles of attack. "Red Oak's waiting for you at the old Morrison place." Joseph continued his weapon, never wavering from its target, aimed at Mary's chest. "Wants to make you an offer you can't refuse. Surrender yourself, and Julia gets to live. Try to run or fight, and she dies slowly while you watch." "That's not happening," Nahiosi said quietly, his voice carrying absolute conviction despite the gun pointed at Mary's heart. Joseph laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "You're outnumbered 20-1 half-blood. Red Oak's got men surrounding this town, more coming from the mining camps. Best you can do is die well and take a few of them with you." "Maybe," Nahiosi replied calmly. "But I've beaten worse odds before." The tension in the room was suffocating everyone, knowing that violence was only moments away. "Deraster," Owen and Grace pressed themselves against the far wall, trying to stay out of the line of fire. Mary's mind raced, looking for options for any advantage they might have. That was when she noticed something that Joseph, in his arrogance, had missed. Grace still had her rifle partially concealed behind a medical cabinet. If Mary could create a distraction... "You're right about one thing, Joseph," Mary said, forcing her voice to remain steady. "I never looked at you the way I look at him. Do you know why?" Joseph's eyes narrowed, but his curiosity got the better of his caution. "Enlighten me." "Because he never had to spy on me to earn my respect. He never had to pretend to be something he wasn't. When he made me a promise, he kept it, even when it cost him everything." Mary took a small step forward, drawing Joseph's full attention. "You're just a coward who sold his soul for silver." The insult hit home, and Joseph's face flushed with anger. His gun hand tightened, and Mary saw his finger begin to squeeze the trigger. But Grace was ready, her rifle speaking with deadly authority. The bullet took Joseph in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending his pistol flying across the room. Nahiosi was moving before Joseph hit the floor, securing the dropped weapon, while Dr. Owen rushed to tend the wounded man. Grace kept her rifle trained on Joseph, her schoolteacher's calm exterior, hiding the steady nerves of someone who just saved their lives. "That was for all the children," Grace said quietly. "All the families you helped destroy with your reports." Joseph clutched his wounded shoulder, his face pale with shock and pain. "This doesn't change anything," he gasped. "Red Oak still has your daughter. He'll kill her if you don't come." "Then we'd better not keep him waiting," Mary replied grimly. As Dr. Owen worked to stop Joseph's bleeding, Mary found herself looking at her small circle of true friends, people who'd risked everything to help her find Julia. Grace, whose moral courage had never wavered. Dr. Owen, whose gentle hands had healed more than just physical wounds. And Nahiosi, whose promise had brought him back across 15 years and countless dangers. "The Morrison place," she said, turning to address them all. "That's where this ends." The Morrison place sat in a hollow 3 miles outside Willow Springs, its burned timbers and collapsed roof a monument to frontier dreams gone wrong. Mary and Nahiosi approached on foot through the surrounding woods, having left their horses tied well out of hearing range. The sun was climbing toward its merciless peak, and heat waves shimmered off the blackened ruins like ghostly apparitions rising from the grave. 20 men, at least, Nahiosi whispered, pointing to the positions he'd identified through careful observation. "Positioned in a rough circle around the ruins, but with gaps we might be able to exploit." Mary studied the scene with a mother's desperate intensity, searching for any sign of Julia among Red Oak's forces. Then she saw her, a slim figure tied to a post in what had once been the Morrisons' kitchen, her head held high despite the circumstances. Even at this distance, even after 15 years, Mary recognized her daughter's unbroken spirit. But Julia wasn't simply waiting passively for rescue. Even bound and under guard, she was constantly moving, testing her bonds, studying her captors, looking for weaknesses. Her eyes never stopped moving, cataloging everything around her like a predator planning an escape. This wasn't the frightened child who'd been taken from the flood. This was a survivor who'd learned to think like her enemies. 15 years, Julia thought, as she tested the rope around her wrists for the 100th time. 15 years of being told my mother was dead, that I was nothing but property to be bought and sold. The rope was thick but old, and she'd been working at it carefully, using a sharp edge on the post behind her to fray the fibers. If she could just get one hand free. She'd seen the men positioning themselves around the ruins, knew this was a trap designed to catch whoever might come for her. But she also knew something they didn't. She wasn't the helpless victim they expected. Years of brutal labor had made her strong, and years of abuse had taught her that survival meant thinking several steps ahead of your enemies. The guard closest to her was young, maybe 17, and she'd caught him looking at her with something like sympathy in his eyes. If she could use that, make him feel protective rather than suspicious. Water. She gasped, letting her voice sound weaker than she felt. Please, I need water. The young guard looked around nervously, then approached with a canteen. As he lifted it to her lips, Julia noted the position of his knife, the way he stood, the fact that his attention was focused entirely on her face rather than her hands. Thank you, she whispered, letting genuine gratitude show in her voice. It wasn't entirely an act. Even her captors occasionally showed small kindnesses, and she'd learned to appreciate them where she found them. She's alive. Mary breathed from her concealed position, relief and terror warring in her chest. More than alive, Nahiosi observed with grudging admiration. Look at her posture. She's not defeated. She's planning something. He was right. Julia sat with the alertness of a coiled spring, her eyes constantly moving as she assessed her surroundings and her captors' positions. This wasn't a victim waiting for rescue. This was a survivor planning her own escape, just looking for the right opportunity. Red Oak himself stood near the ruin's center, his massive frame easily recognizable, even from their concealed position. He was talking to someone Mary couldn't see, gesturing occasionally toward Julia with casual ownership that made her blood boil with maternal rage. How do we get her out? Mary asked, forcing herself to think tactically despite the emotion threatening to overwhelm her judgment. We don't, Nahiosi replied grimly. Not in a straight fight. 20-2 odds are impossible even with the element of surprise. But if we can create enough confusion, enough chaos, Julia might be able to free herself and run. It was a desperate plan with too many variables and not enough certainty. But it was also the only plan they had, and time was running out with each passing minute. Red Oak wouldn't wait forever for them to arrive, and his patience was legendary for being as short as his temper was violent. What do you need me to do? Mary asked, checking the loads in her rifle with hands that were steadier than they had any right to be. Create a distraction on the north side. Something big enough to draw their attention, but not so obvious that they'll see through it immediately. Nahiosi was already moving, sliding through the underbrush with silent precision. Give me 10 minutes to get into position, then make as much noise as possible. Mary nodded, watching him disappear into the forest, like smoke on the wind. Then she was alone with her thoughts, her fears, and the loaded rifle that represented her daughter's only chance for freedom. 10 minutes had never passed so slowly in her entire life. She used the time to study the guard positions, noting which men seemed alert and which were growing careless in the heat. She also watched Julia, seeing the subtle movements that told her daughter was working to free herself. When the time came, Mary did exactly what Nahiosi had suggested. She created noise and confusion on a scale that would have been impressive if it weren't so desperately necessary. Her first shot took out one of Red Oak's sentries, the heavy rifle bullet spinning the man around before dropping him like a stone. Her second shot shattered a whiskey bottle one of the men was holding, sending glass and alcohol flying in all directions. The effect was immediate and exactly what they'd hoped for. Red Oak's men scrambled for cover, shouting orders and trying to locate the source of the gunfire. In the confusion, Mary saw Julia move not toward safety, but toward the nearest of her captors, her hands somehow having worked free of their bonds. What happened next would be burned into Mary's memory forever. Instead of running for the woods, as any sensible person would have done, Julia armed herself with the young guard's knife and began systematically working her way through Red Oak's men with the cold efficiency of someone who'd learned to kill or be killed. She moved like a shadow through the chaos, striking from behind and disappearing before her victims even knew they were in danger. Red Oak himself was screaming orders that no one could hear over the gunfire and general pandemonium. He'd drawn his own weapon and was shooting wildly in all directions, more dangerous to his own men than to any actual enemies. "Find them!" He bellowed, his voice cracking with panic as he watched his operation crumble around him. $20 gold to whoever brings me the half-blood scalp, 50 for the woman alive. But his promises fell on deaf ears. His men were too busy trying to stay alive, as Nahiosi emerged from the forest, like death incarnate, his rifle speaking with deadly precision as he picked off targets with methodical calm. That was when Red Oak's attention turned back to Julia, and his expression changed from panic to cruel calculation. If he couldn't win this fight, he could at least take his revenge on the girl who'd cost him so much. "You want her?" he shouted, grabbing Julia from behind and pressing his pistol to her head. "Come and take her." But Julia had spent 15 years learning that survival meant never giving up, never accepting defeat. Even with a gun to her head, she was still fighting, still looking for her chance. When Red Oak shifted his grip slightly, she drove her elbow back into his ribs with all the strength 15 years of hard labor had given her. The move broke his hold just long enough for Nahiosi's final shot to find its mark. Red Oak's pistol flew from his hand as the bullet shattered his wrist, and Julia rolled away from him with practiced ease. "You think this changes anything?" Red Oak snarled, clutching his wounded arm. "You think killing me solves your problems? I've got partners, allies. They'll hunt you down and make you pay for..." Julia's knife ended his threats with surgical precision. She stood over his body for a moment, breathing heavily, then looked up to see Mary running toward her across the ruined ground. The reunion was everything Mary had dreamed of for 15 years, and nothing like she'd imagined. Julia didn't collapse into her arms like the child she remembered instead. She stood straight and strong, meeting her mother's embrace with the poise of a woman who'd survived hell and emerged unbroken. "I knew you'd come," Julia said quietly, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her face. "I never stopped believing you'd find me." "I'm sorry it took so long," Mary whispered, holding her daughter close and marveling at the strength she could feel in those slender arms. "I'm so sorry, baby girl." "You came," Julia replied simply. "That's what matters." Nahiosi appeared beside them, breathing hard and bleeding from a shallow cut on his cheek, but his expression was one of profound satisfaction. Around them, the survivors of Red Oak's gang were fleeing into the surrounding forest, their organization broken, their leader dead, and their crimes finally brought to light. "We need to leave," he said quietly, scanning the area for any remaining threats, "before more of them show up." But Mary wasn't ready to leave just yet. She had something she needed to say, something that had been building in her heart through all the danger and fear of the past few days. "Julia," she said, taking her daughter's hands in hers, "there's someone I want you to meet properly. This is Nahiosi. He's the one who found you, who brought me back to you." Julia looked at the man who'd kept faith with a promise made 15 years ago, and Mary saw recognition dawn in her eyes. "You're the boy from the stories," she said softly. "The one who made the fox charm." Nahiosi smiled, the expression transforming his weathered face. "And you're the girl who helped hide my bow from the men who would have killed me." "I remember," Julia said. "You taught me to track rabbits in the snow." There was something profound in that moment of recognition, the closing of a circle that had begun with an act of kindness in a desperate winter and ended with another act of loyalty in the harsh light of a summer day. Mary felt the last pieces of her shattered world clicking back into place as she watched her daughter and the man she'd come to love acknowledge their shared history. The sun was setting behind the mountains as they rode away from the Morrison place, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson that spoke of endings and new beginnings. Mary rode between her daughter and Nahiosi, and for the first time in 15 years, she felt complete. The road ahead would bring challenges, certainly. There would be legal proceedings, social obstacles, and the complex work of healing wounds that had festered for years. But they would face those challenges together as a family forged in fire and tempered by the unbreakable bonds of love and loyalty. Behind them, the ruins of the Morrison place stood as a monument to the past and the price of justice. Ahead lay Prairie Rose and the promise of home. Between past and future stretched the present moment, precious beyond measure, because it held everything Mary had thought she'd lost forever. Her daughter was alive. Her promise was kept. Her family was whole again. And that, she realized as she looked at the two people riding beside her, was not just enough. It was everything she'd ever dreamed of, and more than she'd ever dared hope for.